Hello everyone and welcome to All Things Watched. In this video we are going to talk about episode 1 of the old J.J Abrams television show, which was titled Fringe. Now what's funny about this is that we're actually talking about two J.J Abrams shows now, because we just started the review slash recap, basically, sort of like after show type series for his other series as well, which came out right before Fringe, which was titled Lost. And so we're basically going to be tackling two of these huge series at the same time. And I will say as well that if you're interested in watching them with me, you can do so over on our Patreon account. But no big deal if you don't want to. You can support us for free here on YouTube. Just click the subscribe button. And even if you don't want to subscribe, that's cool too. Even just watching the videos and commenting on the videos helps us grow all the same. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and jump into the episode 1 of Fringe, season 1. I hope you guys do watch the series with us, not necessarily on Patreon. I just mean in general. It'd be really cool if you guys watch the series and then join into our episodic recaps and reviews and whatnot in our conversation. And so this episode was simply titled Pilot, which is pretty well the title of most first episodes of new shows and whatnot. And so this episode, a lot like Lost, a previous J.J. Abrams show, actually opens in a plane. And as you can see, it's not a very nice night. You can tell that it's very stormy. But anyways, on this plane, we end up being introduced to this character, and it seems like he has a lot going on, almost like he's sick or something like that, and he ends up actually injecting himself with what appears to be, I would assume, some form of insulin or something like that, because it does appear like he has, this sort of diabetic insulin type needle or some sort, which is, which he obviously has to do. This could explain why he's sweating and why he's, maybe even shaking a little bit or a little bit, disoriented. It could very well be diabetes, because diabetes absolutely could do that to somebody. If you have high sugars or low sugars, this absolutely could be a problem. In this case, if he's giving himself a needle, then it's very likely that he would have high blood sugar and whatnot. But once he injects himself with this needle, we end up learning that something very different ends up happening, and it actually causes him to sort of break out in this very weird infection and whatnot. And we also learn later on in the episode that whatever it is that he has is actually contagious, because once the plane actually lands, yes, that's right folks, the plane actually lands, and you're probably thinking, well, how on earth is that even possible? But it's possible because what happens during the show is the pilot ends up putting the plane on autopilot, and I think they just sum it up in the show as being like this new form of airport or something, like this new form of technology which allows the plane to not only fly on its own but also land and take off on its own. And so that's just sort of how they sum it up. So this plane will land safely, but only because the pilots put it on autopilot. And so this gentleman, when he injects himself, ends up, becoming contagious, and everybody on the plane basically ends up dying. Now, given the fact that he himself dies, I don't believe that he did this intentionally. I don't think that he was probably even aware of what was in the needle. At least I don't get that vibe. I don't think that this was intentional. I think that his diabetic needle or his insulin shot was actually tampered with. I don't think this was intentional on his part. I think that somebody else planted this, causing this outbreak and this contagion on the plane. And so, of course, we end up cutting to basically our main character, or one of our main characters of the entire series, which is the character known as Olivia Dunham. And she is an agent, and of course she will end up being called into action. She will be the one that ends up investigating this case, and she is actually portrayed by the actor known as Anna Torv, or Torev, and she is an absolute phenomenal character, and she does an absolute perfect job with portraying Olivia, and her performance in this series is spot on, to the point where I can't imagine, honestly, this entire cast was spot on, a lot like Lost. All of the entire cast for Lost was spot on, and J.J. Abrams always does a really great job at his casting and really telling these weird, complicated stories and whatnot. But anyways, she's here, and she's actually with another agent, actually, whose name is John Scott, and he's portrayed by Mark Valley, and he's not really in the show a whole lot, but he is in there enough, and he does do a great job with the little bit that he is in there. But either way, Both of them are here, and this is when she ends up getting the call to go in and investigate. And so she ends up going to the airport, and when she shows up, she's greeted by what appears to be her partner right now, like her everyday partner, not her love partner, but this is also another investigator, and this guy's name is Charlie Francis, and you can tell that their relationship is really close. Right from the very get-go, right from this first episode, you can tell that they're very close, and that she really respects him, and I think he really respects her too. Especially by the end of this episode, they really have a lot of respect for each other, and honestly, both of their performances, once again, hats off to the actors. Charlie is portrayed by a character known, or by an actor known as Kirk Acevedo, I believe is how you pronounce his name, Acevedo, and he once again does a phenomenal job, and it's really cool seeing their dynamic and their chemistry on screen. But anyway, so he basically meets up with Olivia, sort of fills her in a little bit, but not really a whole lot, because I think that at this point they don't really have a whole lot of information. So once they all get together, then of course, then we're introduced to another really big character of the whole entire series, who's known as Philip Broyles, and he's sort of like the lead captain. So he would sort of be the boss of Olivia and of Charlie and of John and all the other characters that will eventually be introduced to. He's sort of like the boss. He, sort of tells them where to go. He sort of chooses the cases that they will investigate, and he's sort of like the leader of the Fringe division, which is why the show is called Fringe. You'll learn that by the end of this episode, or I think actually maybe episode 2 is when they officially call it like the Fringe division. And so he's portrayed, of course, by Lance Reddick, who's actually unfortunately no longer alive with us today. He actually passed away not too long ago. So that's really sad, and that's another reason why I'm really excited to really be talking about Fringe and whatnot. It's a great way to honor him and his performance and his acting career. Because he does a phenomenal job in this series. Well, he does a phenomenal job in everything that he's in, but he really stands out in this series, and so he basically calls her aside and kind of tells her, to some degree, sort of puts her in her place, so to speak, almost like, when you gotta like discipline a dog, so to speak. He's basically like, hey, you need to be a team player, but at the same time, he's very encouraging to, sort of like, we chose you for a reason, but you do need to sort of set aside your pride, and you really need to, work with the team here. And so everybody from all the different, agencies, FBI, CIA, or whatever all the investigation agencies are, they end up going into the plane, and once they go in here, then you can see that the bodies are like basically decayed to the point where they're literally skeleton. So that's a really weird phenomenon. Obviously, hence the name Fringe. It's a very Fringe type phenomenon, very Fringe sciencey type thing. It's not something that would normally happen every day. And so, and so they basically investigate everything, and they don't really know what's going on, really. So everybody ends up going back to the headquarters, and they start investigating once again. And of course, one of them ends up getting a lead, and so John and Olivia end up heading out into the field together. Now, this is one little part of the episode where I was like, I don't know if that would really actually happen, given the fact that they're actually seeing each other. But then again, the boss might not really know that they're lovers, so I was able to put that aside. I just sort of chalked it up to the fact that maybe Broyles just simply don't know that they're sleeping together and whatnot. But they do have a really nice moment here, because we learned that Broyles here, ended up telling Olivia earlier that morning that he loved her, and she never really said it back. And I think it might have been because she got interrupted with the phone call, but she ends up sort of making amends and sort of telling him, I do love you too. I did want to say it back and whatnot. So it's just a really nice little moment that they have. But they end up coming here and investigating a whole bunch of these sort of lockers or storage units, and they literally are there all day until John ends up coming across one of the lockers that has a bunch of computers and whatnot. And while he's in there sort of looking at the computers and what appears to be almost like a lab, almost like a biological lab or a chemistry lab, a very scientific lab or setup, whatever you want to call it, while he's in there looking at all that, a door ends up opening behind him, and of course a suspect ends up coming out, and he actually ends up triggering a bomb which explodes, and it ends up sending Olivia back, and she ends up hitting one of the storage units and ends up in the hospital. She's very concussed, very beaten, and very battered. And something really strange happens to John, but we'll talk about that in a second. Of course, the bomb goes off. Like I said, here's Olivia actually in the hospital. As you can tell, she got a really bad cup, and it looks like a really deep gash on her forehead, and so she ends up having to go in and basically be stabilized. But I don't think she has anything that's really life-threatening. She's just sort of, really, like I said, really confused, dazed. They sort of show us what's happening from her perspective. Light is very vibrant and is kind of coming and going. It's almost like she's slipping in and out of consciousness, which once again is all, signs of a really bad concussion. But in the meantime, John, on the other hand, as you can see, something really weird is happening to him in his body, because he somehow, during the explosion, was exposed to some form of chemical, very likely because he was sort of, investigating that science lab, whatever it was. And so this really leads Dunham, which is Olivia, her last name is Dunham. This really leads Dunham with not really a whole lot of answers, because she hasn't really seen anything like this before. So this is sort of like two really weird things happening really close together. First, the airplane with all the passengers in there, becoming skeletons, and now her lover and also work partner John is now here, and his looks like he's actually becoming very transparent. You can see his blood, you can see his organs, you can see, eventually as the episode progresses and as his condition progresses, you're eventually able to actually see his brain and sort of his lungs and heart and whatnot. And so once again, this is a very fringe science type of event happening here that as of right now at least, nobody really knows why. And so because Olivia doesn't really know how to deal with this type of thing, she ends up doing her homework, and she ends up doing a bunch of research, actually typing in like who would be like an infection specialist or a virus, sort of epidermal type infections, who will be a specialist, someone who would know all that stuff. And she ends up coming across a medical journal online, which is signed, and she ends up finding this doctor known as Dr. Walter Bishop. And of course, this we know will also end up becoming a huge character in this whole series. He is one of the main characters, and he's portrayed by John Noble. And John does once again does a phenomenal job with his performance there, playing Dr. Bishop. And so once Olivia finds this out, she ends up taking John's file to Philip, or to Broyles, and basically says to him, hey, I think we should look into this guy. We should give this guy a chance. He may be the only person that can actually fix John and cure John and help John, but also at the same time, he might actually be able to understand the type of situation that they're involved with. And so once Broyles looks at his file, we start to learn a little bit about him now. We learn that he's not allowed in the New York State. I'm pretty sure this is, his driver's license for the New York State is revoked, and we end up learning that he's actually in a mental institution because of a whole bunch of acts and experiments and sort of scientific stuff that he did many, many years ago. Him and his partner, which you'll learn very later on in the series, he was sort of partners with this character known as William Bell, and they sort of, did a whole bunch of very questionable, gray area type of experiments on people, and so he ended up getting locked up. And rather than having to go to jail, they basically lock him up into a mental institution. And so eventually, Broyles ends up giving her the okay. He's like, well, if you really think that this is the only chance that that John has to survive, then maybe we should go ahead and take a chance and go for it. But she does learn while investigating him and learning that even though he is in the mental institution, there's absolutely no way that they can get in there unless it's with someone who's close to kin. Even with their authority, even with their high, levels in government and in authority, even in these investigative agencies, they're still not really able to overrule the court. The court, basically put him in here as a punishment for all these experiments, and so they have no choice but to reach out to his son. And this is when we are introduced once again to another main character of the series, and his name is. His name is Peter Bishop, and he's portrayed by Joshua Jackson. And once again, Joshua Jackson does a fantastic job here with portraying Peter. And right away, right from the get-go, the moment Olivia talks to Peter, you can tell already the type of relationship that he has with his father. You can tell that there is a lot of resentment here, and he really does not want anything to do with it. And it gets to the point where Olivia actually has no choice but to actually threaten him. She's like, listen, dude, we really need your father's help, and if you're not willing to help us, then she's like, I know the kind of trouble you're in, and I know the kind of people that you're in trouble with. And she's like, I can simply make one phone call and tell them exactly where you are and whatnot. So she basically blackmails him, really. But she does what she has to do to basically get his consent, to because she needs him to be willing to help the agency, because if not, they will not have access to Dr. Bishop, to Walter Bishop. And so, with a lot of hesitancy, he ends up finally agreeing, and they end up going to St. Clair's Hospital. And then we get a reveal of Walter Bishop, our first real look at John Noble, and he just does a phenomenal job. Even with the very first time we see him, he's back on facing a wall. He has very much almost like this Dr. Frankenstein type vibe to him right from the very get-go. And when you first meet him, it sort of seems like he's almost losing his mind. And so, but he ends up sitting down and he ends up talking to Olivia, and he's telling him, and she's telling him about the case and everything, all the crazy stuff going on, and he seems to be understanding it. But then, right as they're, sort of right in the middle of their conversation, he basically stops and he's like, hey, I want to see my son, because he knows that there's no way that she could have gotten in there unless Peter was with her, because Peter would have to sign off on it, because like I said, the court order was he would have to have only someone close to kin, so in this case his son. And so she ends up going out and having to talk Peter into going in to see him. Once again, she's faced with a lot of resentment and a lot of pushback from Peter, opposition. He really doesn't want to go in here, but once again she reminds him of the position that she's in and the position that he's in, and she reminds him that, hey, one phone call and we can make all this go away and get you in a lot of trouble. Excuse me. And so he ends up agreeing to go in, and she manages to talk him in. She manages to talk him into going in and seeing him, and ends up eventually actually convincing him to be willing to sign all the discharge papers. And I think it's sort of a combination of a few things here. I think it is a combination of the court order with it being close to kin, and I think also probably a little bit of a combination of Agent Broyle sort of having to come in with a little bit of authority as well, because I don't think that they would have been just allowed to release him. It would have been, he could leave, but under supervision, and also under supervision of closest to kin as well. So basically Peter would take the responsibility of Walter. And so, like I said, he reluctantly agreed, and Walter ends up being let out of the mental institution for the sake of this case and helping to solve this case. And so we get a really funny sequence here with him in the back seat and everything. And the dialogue and the writing in this series was so funny. He's like, uh-oh, or whatever he says, and they kind of look at him. He's like, I think I pissed myself. So that was just a really funny sequence and a really funny scene with him. But eventually we get him to the lab, and and he starts to look at John, and now you really see the sort of mad scientist, the Dr. Frankenstein, really comes out in him, and he becomes very intrigued with John's condition, and he pretty well knows right away what's going on. But just to be sure and just to be safe, he ends up taking some tests, and he actually scrapes off, as you can see, some of the skin. Once again, this special effects was done really well here. You can see like the veins and stuff underneath the skin, really cool. And so he ends up, taking all this stuff and running it through the lab, running it through his lab and everything. He does a bunch of tests, basically confirming his theory. So he does know what's going on. He's just not quite 100% sure how to stop it yet. So he tells them that he needs access to his old lab, which was actually located underneath Harvard, in the basement of Harvard. And so they end up taking him back there. And here, as you can see, right behind Dr. Bishop, there's a young woman coming up the stairs. Her name is Astrid, and she also will become a huge member of the team. She becomes a very big character as well. She's not so much a main character in the sense, like, she's not in every single scene, but she is, I think, in every single episode of the whole series. So she is a very important member of the team. I would say she's as important as anyone else. She's just not like a main actor. She's more like a co-main actor, but still a very important member of the team. So they give Dr. Bishop back his lab in Harvard. They even go as far as bringing in a cow, which is really funny, but I think they say in this because the reason is because the cow's DNA is very similar to humans. Now, of course, Walter, being sort of this mad scientist, Dr. Frankenstein type character, he's like, well, we got to have fresh milk. If you want fresh milk, you need a cow. But the scientific side of it, it's just that cows are very similar to humans in terms of the DNA or the DNA genome or genetic genome or whatever it is. And so I just thought it was really cool and it was really funny that they actually gave that to him. And so eventually all the tests and everything come back basically positive, and Walter is able to basically give John a diagnosis, but he tells him that he's not able to cure him unless he knows the exact chemicals that were actually actually inside of the explosion, so to speak, inside of that lab that he was investigating earlier in these locker storages or storage units and whatnot. And so, obviously, Olivia is like, well, how on earth could we ever, find that out? We have no idea. John is not conscious. We have no idea even who to look for the suspect because she didn't see him, only John did. So, they really don't have much going for him in terms of the investigation. They don't really have any leads. So, Dr. Bishop, once again, sort of steps up in that Frankenstein sort of mad scientist role, and he basically tells her of a really, really fringe type experiment that he could do on her that is not necessarily going to work. Is more of a hypothetical experiment, saying that it could work. There's a very small possibility that it could work, and he tells her that if he had John's body here, then he could put her into a deprivation tank, so to speak, which also sort of acts like an anti-gravity tank, almost like a hyperbolic chamber as well. And he could drug her up on a bunch of LSD and drug him up on LSD and sort of connect their minds through this, like I said, very fringe science type experiment. And of course, Olivia being Olivia and being in love with John, she agrees to do it, and so they end up having John's body transported here. We get a really cool sequence with the ambulance. Just looks really nice with the background, the backdrop. They transport the body, John's body, over, and they then begin the procedure. As you see, they start putting pieces on Olivia's body, different areas. You can see the wire coming from the back of her neck. He ends up putting a probe, I think, that connects into her spinal, either like her spinal cord or her brain or something like that. It connects directly into her nervous system, and then he fills her up full of LSD and different drugs, and then they put her into the deprivation tank. And this sequence was just so cool. It looks really cool. As you can see, she's there and she's floating because they end up filling the water up with salt, which was little details like that I think always makes the difference when you're watching these kind of shows. It's just really cool that the writing actually took the time to put those little details in there. If you want someone to float, you have to put salt in there or else it wouldn't work. And just little things like that. And plus, not only that, but salt is very sterile and very sanitary as well. So I just thought that that was really cool. And so she's in there, and so everybody's outside, and they end up hooking John up to all the equipment as well. And now they're just basically waiting. And so they all end up looking at all the monitors, and they're keeping an eye on everything. Really, basically, one monitor is John, one for Olivia, and they're just keeping track of the vitals and everything, and really waiting for the drugs to kick in, and really waiting for both of them to end up slipping into this dreamlike state, and hopefully have their dreams actually connect. And then after a few minutes, sure enough, as you can see, the top line here is John, and the bottom is Olivia, and you learn that their brains are now in sequence. They're actually in the same phase, and they are now officially connected, thanks to the drugs and the deprivation tank. And I guess John being in a coma sort of represents that deprivation tank, and they actually end up going into this dream sequence. Once again, the special effects here were really, really cool, and it was just a really cool idea, especially for the first episode of a Fringe episode. And so she ends up speaking to John, and she sort of says this final goodbye. I don't think she really believes that he's going to be able to live, but she do get to see him. Now, she don't get the information that she needs. She don't get the list of ingredients that they were hoping to get in order for Dr. Bishop to actually save John, but she was able to see the person that blew everything up, so she is able now to identify and sort of create a suspect illustration or sketch, whatever you want to call, and whatnot. And as soon as she gets this information, she comes to really quick, and she starts. It's almost like she goes into cardiac arrest, but they're able to stabilize her, and they're able to calm her down. And she comes to, and she tells them that she sees an image of a man, and so she ends up going down with, I guess, with sort of like these computer engineers or these sketch artists who's able to create this sketch of the suspect, and then they run it through all the databases, and they end up getting a confirmation, which ends up leading them then to this character, and this character's name is Nina Sharp, and she works over at Massive Dynamic, and Massive Dynamic is really a building which is very advanced. As you can see, she only has one arm, and she has a bionic arm. That bionic arm was created by Massive Dynamic, and Massive Dynamic, the building itself, the company itself, is almost a character in this whole series as well, and a lot of these advanced operations and a lot of this very fringe science type stuff is really happening here at Massive Dynamics. They're kind of like Walter. Actually, a lot of this comes from Walter, which you learn later on in the series, but we won't get into that right now. But either way, Nina's a really cool character, really interesting. It's really cool to see her bionic arm. It also gives you an idea of the type of world that we're dealing with here, where science is really advancing at a very fast rate. So she goes here asking about the guy, the suspect that they end up illustrating, and Nina ends up being very cooperative. She gives them all the files that Massive Dynamic has on the character, and this ends up leading Olivia and the FBI team to a raid on his apartment. And so they end up going in with all of the guns blazing, right ready to go, and they end up finding a secret hatch in his apartment, which is actually, when they go down there, it actually has basically sort of like a little science lab down there, sort of like what John found at the storage units. You can tell that this person is very scientific, has a lot of chemicals, has a lot of stuff going on in the basement. Very weird, fringy type stuff, but he himself is not there. But he is in the area, and he ends up taking off. So he ends up escaping from the police, and this, of course, ends up leading to a pretty cool chase between Olivia and the suspect. And it ends up being, and it was actually Peter who ends up intervening, and he catches the suspect. And so, they're able to catch him, arrest him, and bring him in for questioning. So Olivia goes in, and she starts to question him, but she's not really making any progress with her questioning. Is sort of, she's sort of being like the good cop. She's trying to be a bad cop, but because she is an officer, she can't really do anything. She can't literally sit down and torture the guy because there's rules, there's regulations, and all that kind of stuff. Whereas Peter, on the other hand, he does not really have any rules, regulations, or at the very least, he doesn't have a badge. And so he goes in and he actually does torture the guy, and basically like crushes his hand and beats him up a little bit. And of course, then they are able to get the information that they need. And so as soon as they get this information, Walter ends up he starts putting together the concoction of chemicals and an antidote, so to speak, which should hypothetically and theoretically, bring John back to normal health and allow his cellular, muscles to come back and regenerate as opposed to deteriorate, sort of get rid of that, that sort of being able to see through him, that transparent, body or whatnot, all that should be reversed with this serum. And so because of how good of a job that they did with this investigation, and because of this really strange, weird experiment that Walter performed on Olivia, Agent Broyles ends up coming and actually telling Olivia that she did a really good job and that he would like her to actually stay with him and keep working with him in the Fringe division, and that she should be the head of it and be the leader, and she should take over. And because he tells her that there's a lot of cases like this happening all around the world, and he thinks that a lot of experiments that Dr. Bishop and them used to be doing back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, he thinks that a lot of them experiments are now being done on a bigger, more global scale, and they don't really understand or know why. And so he tells her that he wants her to basically be the head of this department and basically be the leader of the Fringe division, and she would be, like I said, she would basically be the boss, and she would be allowed to keep Peter and keep Walter under her. So it's just really cool to see that relationship, because at the beginning of the episode he was kind of hesitant with her, telling her, she needs to keep cool, she needs to be a team player. And now here by the end of this episode, he's like, yeah, I sort of want you to stick around. You did a great job here. You worked with everybody. You guys did some crazy experiments that we didn't understand, but at the end of the day, it actually worked. And so Olivia ends up going in and talking to the suspect herself, and he ends up telling her that he was actually not the mastermind behind the plan, and he actually tells her about a recording that he has tucked away, and tells her that he can prove that he's innocent and that he's not the one that's behind everything. He just simply did what he was told, so to speak. And so, of course, Olivia, being a detective, she ends up going and searching for the recording that he told her, and it ends up being exactly where he said it was. And she digs it up out of the location, puts it in the little recorder thing to play it, and she ends up on she actually knows the conversation that she's listening to, because she ends up remembering back, and we get a quick little flashback to the airport scene, and she learns that John is actually the one that this suspect was talking to, which means her boyfriend and her partner on the job is actually the person behind this, and that he is actually a bad guy and not a good guy. And as soon as this is revealed, while she's listening to this tape over at the suspect's, or close to the suspect's house in her own vehicle, John ends up being recovered enough to the point where he wakes up in the hospital, and then he goes over to the suspect and he kills him. Of course, because the suspect is a loose end, and because he is a problem, and so, obviously he has to deal with the problem, and so he goes over and actually kills the guy and suffocates him over at the hospital. He then ends up taking off, and of course, and we get this really cool car chase scene between John and Olivia. And of course, Olivia ends up catching up to him, and John ends up going off the road because she's chasing him, trying to arrest him, basically. I think more so, even maybe not so much arrest him, but question him, sort of ask him why is he, why did he do what he did. And of course, he ends up flipping over the car, and he ends up dying. And this is very dramatic for Olivia. Literally that same day they had just told each other they loved each other, and now it's revealed that John is actually a bad guy, and so he ends up dying in her arms. And of course, she is absolutely busted over this. You get a really sad scene here where she sat down and she's, crying in the back of the ambulance. I just don't think she really knows how to sort of comprehend everything that's going on. We get this really weird case with really weird, things going on. People literally dying, skin literally coming off bones, and these weird experiments. She just did a bunch of LSD, literally communicated with John in his dreams, and then turns out that John is a bad guy and that he was working for the enemy the whole time, which is also probably a little bit of a blow on herself, sort of with her self-confidence, because she is an investigator, so you think that she would have caught on to this, but she didn't. She was basically sleeping with the enemy, and so she probably feels like he was using her, and who knows what else, what other information he was able to get because of their relationship. So then we get to the very final scene here, or at the very end of the episode, and basically Olivia ends up confronting Peter and basically tells him, hey, I think that I need you to stay because we want to continue this sort of little Fringe division. We want Walter to be a part of this team, and we want to keep investigating all these sort of phenomenons that's happening around the world. And of course, he's a little reluctant to do that at first, but he does give in and he does agree. And I don't know that Olivia would have agreed to this if things didn't turn out the way they did, but once she found out that John was bad and that John ends up dying, I think that was like the final push that really forced her to, end up joining the Fringe division and agreeing to take over with Broyles and whatnot, sort of as her boss. And then, of course, I think that this is probably also what caused Peter to agree to joining the division as well. I think it's just because he got to see that his father is not just this crazy mad scientist who went around hurting people, but in this situation, in this one case alone, he was able to use that fringe science to actually help people and help solve a case and actually potentially save hundreds of other lives as well. And then the very final scene of the episode then is John. His body is now gone to massive dynamics, and Nina asks how long has he been dead, and the guy tells her 5 hours, and he says, okay, hook him up, because if you remember earlier in the episode, Walter told Olivia that you could speak to a dead body for up to 6 hours after they were dead, and so John has been gone for 5 hours, and so Nina wants to hook him up, I'm assuming to find out, or to try to find out what information he might have told, or to basically to just sort of witness. I'm assuming just so that she can see all the information that he knew, and also what information he might have told Walter and the rest of the team. And that is essentially where the pilot episode of Fringe ended. And this was actually an hour and a half long episode. And honestly, right from the very beginning to the end, I thought it was really, really well done. It was really well written. The story was very interesting and very intriguing. And we really get to see this very strange group of people come together to start, to start solving these very strange cases. And so I absolutely love this series, and I can't wait to talk about the series as a whole, and to go down through each episode and watch them all, and talk about them with you guys here. And I'm not going to say too much more about this episode, this pilot, just because there's so much more to dive into later on, because by the end of the series, at the very last, I believe maybe even the finale of the series, we almost go full circle. We end up getting cases that are very similar and whatnot, and so they sort of do come full circle by the end of the series. And honestly, it was just a lot of fun. It was a great cast, great characters, and a great story overall. And I honestly had a lot of fun. So let me know your comments down in the comment section below. And if you like this video, click that subscribe button. And until the next one, take care.